We can pick up where we left off last time. We talked about chapter 11, and one of the main things that I wanted to talk about with, some of the assumptions that John Shelby Spong is working under really come from this theologian by the name of Paul Tillich. And we talked about him last time, but I wanted to develop that a little bit more with respect to Tillich, because it's just a kind of an underlying foundation of everything that Spong is talking about. And I wanted to develop a little bit of Tillich's thought, and actually something a little more general in Tillich, and that is something called panentheism. And I think it will help us as, Spong continues to talk about God as this permeating presence. But just remind you of that quote we talked about last night or last time, and that is, God has to be understood in the Tillichian cosmology and the way that Tillich understood his theology as the ground of being, not a being that's distinctive and separate from other beings. That's where Tillich says we get into so many theological problems, because then we try to apply superlatives to a finite entity who is a being. To suggest something that is a being means that it is, that it's finite, it's limited, it's bounded. And that's where Tillich wants to take us in a different direction. And Tillich is really building on this Platonic mystical tradition that we've talked about, that really goes back earlier in the Jewish tradition and into the wisdom tradition. And of course, in Qumran, the Qumran community among the Essenes, there was a sense of the permeating presence of God. And that gets adopted by Christian theology later on. And we're still working through this. And it's always been a kind of a minority perspective in Christianity. But I wanted to have this little interlude here, another Tillichian interlude, and tell you about panentheism, because it is the theological foundation of Tillich's thought, and is influencing Spong's thought as well. And I think if we know a little bit about it, as you read Spong, you might have a little clearer understanding of what he's talking about. Jesus introducing into the world a new consciousness that involves accepting a new kind of freedom, but with that freedom comes a lot of anxiety about being truly living free, and removing yourself from all past traditions. For example, the Jewish tradition focusing on the law and authoritarian types of pronouncements. So when we talk about God, there are, four. I've listed four, but really the last two, one of them is a misunderstanding of the other. And in the Christian tradition, we refer to ourselves as theists. In other words, God is a being, and usually existing in this three-tier universe. God is personal. God is one with whom human beings can communicate, and God freely offers God's self in communication with human beings. But the idea of God being personal, that's theistic. And of course, we can talk about monotheism, where we believe in one God, or polytheism, where you believe in many gods. But it's just the foundation of our traditional understanding of Christianity, that there is a God, and that God is personal, and God is in a relationship with the world and with beings in the world, primarily human beings. Of course, in the 19th century, the introduction of Nietzsche and people before him, that this whole idea of the three-tier universe and a God who is in communication with human beings and in some way actively participating in the creation of the world itself, the continuous creation of the world, comes under attack. And this is where we get atheism, the equally undemonstrable, undemonstrable belief that there is no God, right? Theism and atheism really go hand in hand in terms of just how well they can demonstrate their first premise, right? Is just as easy to demonstrate there is a God as it is to demonstrate there is not a God. Actually, I should say it's just as impossible to demonstrate that there is a God as it is to demonstrate that there is not a God. So we know about that, theism, atheism. But in the Eastern traditions, and I should say in the Western understanding of Eastern traditions, this understanding of God as a permeating presence in the world came to be called pantheism, that God is all things. Okay, literally, pantheism, all is God. And that's really a mischaracterization, a misunderstanding of Hinduism. But nevertheless, it came to be a term that was frequently used among scholars and as well as lay people alike. But the more appropriate term here is something called panentheism. And that is the idea, and this is where Tillich comes in, this is where Spong comes in, that all is within God. So imagine God as being all being, and we are participants in that being. So instead of saying God is within me, is more accurate to say is I am within God. And you'll see times when Spong even talks about Jesus being within the will of God. So if God is still personal, still active in the world, but God is not distant from the world, God is the foundation of the world, and we are all participating in the spirit of God. The world, it is often said, is God's body. And, just as we are a body with a soul or a spirit, you might say, so the world itself and all entities within it is a body that is enlivened by the soul of God. So that's kind of, that's really unusual for many people to think about. It's like we're swimming in the ocean of God. Now, the thing that's interesting is that, let's use that metaphor continually. The ocean has currents, right? And we might compare that to the will of God, that God's goodwill towards God's created world. There's a current within the ocean of God's soul, you might say. However, many of us, as a result of our own ego, like to swim against that current. And what we need to do is to match our will with the greater will of God within whom we are living and whom we move and have our being. And that's what Jesus does, is he is the one who is perfectly aligned with the will of God and thus is one with the Father. I hope that makes sense. Any questions about that? So it seems natural when Jesus says, I and the Father are one, we have to hear that in the panentheistic way that Spong wants us to hear it. If we hear it in the theistic way, then it creates all kinds of problems for us, because here's this finite Jesus trying to claim the very same being as the infinite God, who is a being as well. And it doesn't make sense, and it ends up being considered blasphemous, right? It is blasphemous in that theistic tradition. But it is, and here's the place that is going to sound like it's blasphemy. It is equally as viable to say that I and the Father are one, that I, Dan Deffenbaugh, and the Father are one. If I had the perfect God consciousness that Jesus had, I too would be one with the Father. I don't, of course. I'm still tripped up by my own ego and my own will and all those kinds of things. But in theism, the emphasis is on it's only Jesus. Jesus is the incarnation of God, and it is God it's in him and in him alone where we can see God. And this is the place where many people have a hard time with this. We all have the capability of being one with God in panentheism. It's right there in front of us if we just learn to temper our will and to put aside our fears, all of those things that want to make us hang on to, if I can use the Freudian term ego, this sense of I, this individuality that we have. But it is equally possible for us to become one with God as well. God is the ground of our being, and we need to, according to this way of seeing things, we need to get rid of the clutter in our lives that prevent us from seeing and realizing that. So I hope that I hope that isn't too overwhelming, but I wanted to introduce that because this is part of Tillich, and I think it's also lingering in the background of Spong as well. And somebody please tell me they understand what I'm saying, because this is very difficult. This is difficult stuff.
Dan, I think I understand that. I dusted off a little of my old Paul Tillich from my library. Probably hadn't touched the book for 50 years.
Oh, really?
I made a lot of notes in it back then. I was pretty impressed with myself. I don't think I have that kind of work ethic today for sure.
Yeah.
But the thing that came through to me, and it does to Spong, and the way I think that it helps to think about it is where the problem arises is when God and Jesus are seen as objects.
Objects.
When you see God, now Tillich says it is a personal God. It is personal, but it's a symbol.
Right.
And God is our personal symbol for the ground of being and all of that. But the problem you run into is when you objectify God. And he in this book, which I think he wrote, one that I've checked out, he wrote in 1959. What brought this to the fore at that time was an article written some years earlier by Albert Einstein, right, which had a lot of prominence, I guess. And as he said, there was really nothing new. It was, stuff that had been around for 100 years, but it caught people's attention. And he talked about, that given the science of the time, and we've talked about this before, that three-tiered thing is, you can't look at it that way.
Right.
And so when you start objectifying these people, you lose out on their understanding. You lose an understanding of their significance.
Right. And it's also interesting that this language is being adopted by many of the so-called quantum physicists who try to explain what happens in our universe at the quantum level when you get down even beyond the protons and the neutrons and the electrons, and you start dealing with things like quarks and leptons and all of these things that I have no idea what they're talking about. But when you get to that point, you can't objectify, you can't rationally treat as objects the entities that you are, or the reality that you're working with, and the quark and electron, because it will not, if you look at it one way, it will act one way. If you look at it another way, it will act a different way, So at the ground of everything, of even, we used to think that atoms were at the base of everything, but now we know that they're built of building blocks as well. But at the ground of everything, there is this or incomprehensible hum, you might say, that is that many will refer to in God language. You know, it's beyond everything we know, but it's God. When you look at God as an object, as we have, then you want to objectify that God in idolatrous ways. And that God is the one who gives the word, the Bible, and that can become an object of idolatry. And this is the problem that Jesus is trying to address in the first century, according to Spong. Remember what's happening at this time. You have the synagogue, and you can't help but, you know, give the Pharisees and the Jews a little bit of credit. In 70 of the Common Era, this is a model of the temple right here. That's probably what it would have looked like in Jesus' day. This is the temple, Holy of Holies right here. If you can see my cursor, we're facing east. We're looking at it from the north side of the temple, which is a side that you don't often see. But in 70 of the Common Era, I mean, this was the center of Jewish life. This was the center of Jewish law, the center of Jewish communication with God. It was this grand objective structure that was the conduit between Jews and God. But prior to this time, there were many Jews who were saying, you know, do you think we really need the temple? And these would have been the people who are aware of the presence of God in the world. I don't need this temple, because God is here with me, or more specifically, I am within God. The presence of God is all around me. And when I go to the temple, then I'm just focusing on the rituals that are happening there, and I'm tying them to this very, very limited understanding of who God is. But if I'm a guy out in the desert, in the Qumran community, the Essenes, who, you know, are out under the stars every night, watching the planets, you know, and watching the change of the seasons, you have an incredibly multifarious understanding of the nature of God. God is entirely complex. And it's this tradition that Jesus is going to rise out of. But in 70 of the Common Era, when this temple was destroyed, Jews really had a difficult time trying to decide who they were going to be, because one of their means of objectifying God and assuring that those objects had authority had just been destroyed by the Romans. That temple that you're looking at right there was completely decimated, which left it to Pharisees and rabbis in small little organizations called synagogues all over Judea to try to pick up the pieces. And naturally, when you're wounded, a wounded animal will always seek refuge in some sort of very, very limited space, right? If you've ever, you know, it's a terrible thing, but if you've ever seen a dog or a cat or something get hit by a car or wounded, they'll want to go to this tiny little space where their environment is very, very controlled, you know, and whether they're going to die or they're going to heal, but they're not going to stay out in the open. Well, the same thing happens really when you have a culture that is on the ropes and it's almost been destroyed. You want to wrap it up in as manageable an environment as possible. And the one thing that still remained after the temple was destroyed was the law. We've got the Torah. We've got all of these rules that if we follow, we can be assured that God will shed God's grace on us, right? So after 70 or so, and even prior to that time, you know, but after 70, when the temple was gone, within 20 years, this is when the Johannine community is writing its gospel. And they are working in the context of Jews who are trying to understand what it means to be Jewish without the temple. And naturally, what they're going to do is, like a wounded animal, seek out a very safe, manageable environment within the law that's interpreted a particular way. We've always done it this way. And into that, Jesus of Nazareth comes and throws a wrench. By saying, you got rid of the temple, now get rid of your highly fearful reliance upon the law. Not that the law has been, or what's the right word? Not that the law has been, pushed aside. The law is a limited understanding of who God is. It was necessary at the time when God gave it on Mount Sinai, but that was 1,200 years prior to the time of Jesus. And look how we've grown. And we've come to realize that God is a presence in this world that is accessible to everybody. But that access comes with a price. The price is freedom and all of the anxiety that comes with freedom. So you can do one of two things. You can continue to live in a very limited way, never coming to realize what your full humanity is capable of. Your full humanity is capable of becoming one with God. I almost feel blasphemous by saying that. You can live tied up in the law, bound to it, fearful, anxious, never breaking away from it. Or you can take on this new consciousness that Jesus exemplifies in his life and come to, live in a new way, a new understanding of who God is, that breaks down barriers, between Jews and Jews, between Jews and Gentiles, between, men and women, breaks down all of those barriers and helps us to recognize the common ground of being that we have, which is God. And the only thing that stands in our way is us. We are standing in our own way. That's why I love the autobiography of Alan Watts. It was called In My Own Way. Of course, he's a Zen Buddhist, but it's a double entendre, right? I will achieve my understanding of a new consciousness in my own way, but I will be in my own way as I try to achieve that. So, all right, well, anyway, let me stop there. That was another little diatribe, I guess, that I had. Any further comments or questions?
Dan.
Yeah, Denny.
I'm thinking back to the earliest hunter-gatherers, herders societies, and the concept of the idea of solidarity and conformity very well was a survival technique.
Sure.
Which is kind of at war with what we're saying here, which takes a great deal of understanding of abstract ideas, which probably elude a whole bunch of the human race.
Yeah, you're right. And the irony of that is that we often look back to the hunter-gatherers. Well, there's an author by the name of Paul Shepard who talked about, agriculture being the place where this extreme objectification of God started happening.
Absolutely.
Among the hunter-gatherers, God was still recognized as, like this permeating presence in the world. But what you're saying, Denny, is that because of the conflict that usually resulted from limited resources, people had to become tribal, and they had to, limit that understanding of solidarity with other people. That's how we came to, and we still do it. I mean, if we could just get over this, that's how you came to identify yourself, not so much as who you were, but over against who you're not. We're not that tribal group over on the other side of the river. In fact, they're the problem. In fact, they are everything that's wrong with this world, right? So you do everything the way they don't. And we still do that. And that's what Jesus is trying to break down here, right? Yeah, several thousand years after the hunter-gatherers. Go ahead, Denny.
Yeah, agriculture, particularly irrigation, really created specialization, labor specialization,
Right.
which was the antithesis of hunter-gatherer societies, which were had to be very, very cooperative
Right.
societies where everybody did basically the same thing, women and men.
Yeah. And agriculture creates specialization, and not only that, an aristocratic class who are closer to the gods than the grunt labor class, and there we have it. And what do we do? What's the first thing that really marks human civilization? We build walled cities. We start, look at Epic of Gilgamesh. The first chapter of that whole epic is, look how wonderful this wonderful walled city is. We've built this wall around ourselves, and tearing down the temple walls, had Jesus been around to see it, I bet he would have said, well, now there's a metaphor I can work with. There's a metaphor I can work with. These temple walls, these walls that we built around ourselves, are keeping us from understanding God as the true source of being that we all share, instead of my God versus your God. So, well, anyway, I'm not getting very far ahead of myself, but I love this. Whenever you start talking about hunter-gatherers, I get excited because Paul Shepard believes that was the place where the true fall took place, the fall into civilization. Well, in chapter 12, we're looking at a story, yet another one of the stories where Jesus is teaching, but in a very provocative way. And this is the story of the crippled man who was crippled for 38 years. And it is interesting. And Spong, I wish he would have reflected a little bit more on this. But whenever you see a number like this in the Bible, the classic example is in the Gospel of John, the very last chapter, where the resurrected Jesus is talking to the disciples who've been out, or the apostles who've been out all night fishing in the boat. They haven't caught anything. And Jesus says, well, throw your nets over the side. And they pulled out this huge catch. And do you remember how many fish they had? I think it was 128 or something. I can't remember the exact number, but those numbers are there for a reason, right? It would have sufficed if they weren't there for a reason. It would have sufficed to say, oh yeah, and they pulled out fish that almost broke the nets. There were so many of them, but 128. Now, why 128? Well, I won't go down that road. There are a lot of people who have ideas on that. But here we have another instance of it. This man who is at the pool of, well, it's Bethzatha in Aramaic, but we have anglicized it to Bethesda. But this man at the pools of Bethesda has been crippled for 38 years. And to give you a little background on this is an actual place. But before I say that, just remember that the context that we're talking about here, and this would be chapter 5 of the Gospel of John. The author of John, the gospel writer, is writing in a context where there's conflict between his community, people who are believing in this new consciousness that Jesus comes to bring, and the Jewish community of the synagogue, who have pretty much had it with the followers of Jesus, claiming that Jesus is the Messiah and all these things that the Jews, could not abide by. They just could not accept. So by the time that John is being written, this conflict has resulted in the Johannine community being excommunicated. And Spong dates this around 88 of the Common Era or so. And actually, you might remember earlier, and I can't remember when it was, we talked about this, but you can see strands of conflict throughout the Gospel of John, where they're part of the Jewish community. They're now they're starting to have some problems, and now they're excommunicated. There are strands of literature that are written at each of those experiences there. So this is the conflict that's going on. And the story is of Jesus, who goes up to Jerusalem for one of the Jewish festivals. We don't know which one. Jesus is always in the Gospel of John going to Jerusalem for various festivals, unlike in the Synoptic Gospels, where it appears that he goes only once, right? But in John, several times. And he comes to the pool at Bethesda, and there encounters a man who has been crippled for 38 years. And actually, lest I miss any part of the story, I'm going to read it. And I hope you don't mind me doing this. I mean, we're studying the Gospel of John. I should probably be reading it too. So after this, after the Gentiles' official son being healed, after this, there was a festival of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now, in Jerusalem, by the sheep gate, there is a pool called in Hebrew Bethzatha, which has 5 porticos. In these lay many invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed. One man was there who had been ill for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had been there a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be made well?" The sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up. And while I'm making my way, someone else steps down ahead of me." Jesus said to him, "Stand up, take your mat, and walk." At once the man was made well, and he took up his mat and began to walk. Now that day was a Sabbath. So the Jews said to the man who had been cured, "It is the Sabbath. It's not lawful for you to be carrying your mat." But the man answered, "The man who made me well said to me, 'Take up your mat and walk.'" They asked him, "Who is this man? And who said to you, 'Take up your mat and walk'?" And now the man who had been healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had disappeared into the crowd. Later, Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, "See, you've been made well. Do not sin anymore, so that nothing worse happens to you." Do not sin anymore, so that nothing worse happens to you. The man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus, speaking of sinning, right? Told the Jews it was Jesus who had made him well. Therefore, the Jews started persecuting Jesus because he was doing such things on the Sabbath. But Jesus answered them, "My Father is still working, and I'm also working." For this reason, the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, because he was not only breaking the Sabbath, but was also calling God his own Father, thereby making himself equal to God. Wow, there's a lot there. And first, let me just ask, are there any thoughts as we're reading this? And I hope you don't mind, but I would like to continue to read from the gospel, because I for some reason have just been skipping over that, assuming that you know the stories, but I can't assume that, right? Any thoughts that come to your mind upon hearing that gospel read? If not, let me give you a little bit of, I guess, geographical background here. This pool at Bethesda, it's of course where we have our Bethesda Naval Hospital, is named after this very pool, but it was understood at the time. Now, let me back up. You may know that Jerusalem is built on a series of springs. There is water that runs beneath this outcropping of rock in Jerusalem. There are 2 valleys on the side, the Valley of Hinnom and the Kidron Valley, and they come down into this point, and then the Temple Mount is built up above those 2 spring-fed streams. But those streams also spring up in various places there on the mountain. One of those places is at this pool called Bethesda or Bethesda. And it was understood at the time that that in one of these pools, that God's Spirit would come and trouble the waters. And if you could get to the pool first, when those waters were being troubled, you would be healed. Now, naturally, this is probably some.
Okay,
Go ahead. I'm sorry. Now, this is probably some, when the spring has some sort of erratic movement to it and it creates, some bubbling up in the well, that was understood to be, the Spirit of God calling the infirm to come and get healed. And the first person to come down would be healed. This is a reconstruction of what that pool looked like. These two buildings right here would be porticos that are being talked about. And apparently invalids would sit in these hallways and wait for the pool to be troubled. This is the temple we were just talking about. This is the north end of the temple. Here's another scale model of it. This is the eastern wall, the temple. There is down here below, is what's called the Kidron Valley, and that's where water runs down. Then over here, there's another, up where it says crucifixion, there's another valley called the Valley of Hinnom. And between these two, you have Jerusalem and the Temple Mount being built. And so here's the temple. Here is the Antonia Fortress. You might know that this is where a garrison of Roman soldiers would be stationed. And, because there was always trouble at the temple. And so best to have those soldiers right there as there still is trouble at this very Temple Mount today. This is where the Romans would be stationed. And then just to the north, the Pool of Israel is where Jews would purify themselves before going into the temple precincts. But then to the north of here, there's these series of springs that were built into a kind of like medicinal springs. And there were these, buildings that were built around them and halls around them. So you could just simply walk down into the water. This is what the two buildings look like. Two pools here. You can see the water. And these, by the way, are models. In Jerusalem, I've never been there, but if you go there, they have these beautiful scale models of what, like, I don't know what the scale is, but basically they're small things. They look big here. These scale models of what Jerusalem probably looked like in the time of Jesus. But this is these are the pools at Bethesda. This is what remains of that today. So it's still there, just to the north of the temple. So, some of you have been to Jerusalem, and probably more recently than others, but just to walk in the midst of this would be a thrill, I think, a thrill for me, because this is a place where clearly Jesus would have been in Jerusalem. So any questions about this little geographical excursion we've just taken?
Dan, I think if I remember right, we were able to see what the photo that you have here depicting the fountains, because they have constructed an overhead walkway, which is
really?
really cool.
Wow. Yeah. Well, I hope to be there someday, but anymore, I'm in my old age, I'm getting more and more anxious over just being in Israel in general, if you know what I mean. Well, so let's go back to the story. There's a lot about the story that is instructive. First of all, Jesus speaks to this man, do you want to be healed? And the man comes up, and at first you say, yeah, of course, you're an invalid, but he comes up with an excuse. Well, I don't have anybody to help me down in the pool and things like that. And so Jesus basically says, you can be healed, stand up and walk. Well, he does, something compels him to stand up and walk. Well, that's part of the story. Now, note, he never goes into the water itself. Sometimes there are depictions of this where the man is being thrown into the water by Jesus and things like that, and nothing of that. Apart from the pool itself, Jesus calls forth the man from his fear into a new understanding of himself as being healed. But then I'm trying to think of a good analogy here. He has the ability now to fully appreciate this new life that he's been given. But then in the midst of the controversy, he sinks back. Now, he doesn't become crippled again, but he sinks back into a kind of a spiritual crippledness. I hate to use that term cripple because we're not supposed to be using that these days, but that is the language that Spong is using. And so I'm going to continue to do that based on what Spong is saying. But his healing calls the attention of the authorities. And they're upset because, he's walking around and he's carrying his pallet, his little mattress that he sleeps on. And they're saying to him, these are the Jews, the very Jews that have been in the synagogue that the Christians are probably having problems with. And they say to him, hey, what are you doing? You're walking, you're carrying your mat, you're working on the Sabbath. And what does the guy do? But he says, oh, I was given permission by the guy that healed me. And they said, healed you? Oh, you mean you were healed on the Sabbath? And the man says, yes. And they said, who was that healed you on the Sabbath? The man said, I don't know who it was, but he healed me. So Jesus by this time had, dispersed into the crowd. Later, the man is in the temple and Jesus sees him and says, hey, don't sin anymore. See how well you are. And the man immediately goes running back to the Pharisees, right? Which is so telling. He goes back to, let's look at it symbolically. He immediately goes back to what he knew best, right? He goes and tells the Pharisees, this is the guy who did it, And Spong makes the point that this is somebody like many human beings, and perhaps a representative. This is all symbolic, right? We don't know that it ever historically happened, but a representative of the Jews in the synagogue who, for let's just say the last 38 years, have been grappling, from the time this was being written, about 88 of the Common Era, from 50 to 88 of the Common Era, there was this conflict in the synagogue. Is Jesus the Messiah? Should we as a synagogue recognize him as Messiah? Should we abide by his teachings and be less restrained by the law? These kinds of questions, perhaps, and this is what Spong suggests, these kinds of questions roiled in the minds of people for 38 years until finally the Christian community, the Johannine community, believers in Jesus, were thrown out. The man who is healed by Jesus, but is unable to make the step to be completely part of the Johannine community, represents those Jews in the synagogue who see the importance of Jesus, but are unwilling to break free from what they know best. This is Spong's argument here. So it's all very, very symbolic and reflective of the conflict that was going on in the Johannine community with the synagogue. Let me stop there. I found this chapter a bit brief and a little bit harder to understand where Spong was coming from, but I do have a quote that I want to read there. Jesus, of course, is accused not with just healing on the Sabbath, but then, when he has I didn't read this part, but when he has his confrontation with the Pharisees, and he claims that he is doing his Father's work, that God himself is working on the Sabbath. Look, he took an invalid and turned him into something new. And you are going to claim that this is somehow against the law when it is God's work that has done this? That doesn't make sense, right? No one can deny that this is God who has done the healing. This has not been done by any form of trickery, but only God can take what is broken and make it whole again. And you are going to claim that God is breaking the law. That doesn't make sense. That is emblematic. That's reflective of the kinds of arguments that were going on in the synagogue. I wanted to read this last quote here. The crippled man, like many people in the synagogue who experienced Jesus but weren't able to take the leap of faith, goes back to what he knows best. He goes back to leading his life of being bound by the law. The crippled man experienced new life and wholeness, but it's clear that he did not grasp it and he did not enter it. He could not stand in this new life, this new freedom, this thing Paul had called the glorious liberty of the children of God in Romans. The crippled man chose rather to seek the favor of the synagogue authorities, to trust in the security of his religious rules. He trembled on the edge of a new consciousness, then fell back into what he believed was the certainty of the past. Wasn't able to take that leap of faith that Kierkegaard in Fear and Trembling talks about, right? This is not just like I'll step forward and I'll just, start living in a new way. No, this is something that you enter upon with great trepidation. It's freedom, but it's not a happy, anxiety-free freedom, right? That is how the fourth gospel viewed the conflict between the synagogue and now the excommunicated Johannine community. Many members of that community could not endure the split. They tried to do the new thing, but couldn't do it. They could not imagine that they could survive without clinging to the past. They could not bear the anxiety of the uncertainty that maturity always requires. They could not bear the anxiety of the uncertainty that a mature faith always requires. They actually wanted to hide in something less than life. So instead of recognizing that they dwelled in God, who was freedom, they chose to place blinders on themselves and try to ignore the presence of this new consciousness that was being given to them and fall back on old habits, and thus give up on becoming truly human. I don't know about you, but as I was reading this, I was reminded of the legend of the Grand Inquisitor, Fyodor Dostoevsky. That little story in the Brothers Karamazov, where Jesus returns during the time of the Spanish Inquisition, and he's immediately rounded up by the church, and he's brought before the Grand Inquisitor and accused of being a blasphemer. Well, no, what is the right word? Well, he's sentenced to death. And all of this comes about, and it's a good 20 or 30 pages. But basically, the Grand Inquisitor says, hey, look, you came to give people a kind of freedom that they can't handle. They're weak little human beings. And so we, for the last 1,600 years, this was happening in the 16th century, we've done our best to work in empathy and to give people what they want. We give them the rules, we give them the laws, we tell them that everything's going to be fine. And you come and you want to reintroduce this freedom to them and mess up all of our work for the last 16 centuries. I don't think so. And for that reason, we are going to put you to death as the worst heretic there ever was. But this is what Spong is talking about here. This freedom, it's not something every human being can handle. And this is why most of our religions today want to fall back on the kind of the fundamentalism that we see of give me the right answer and I'll tell you what's right. Anyway, I just completely obliterated the legend of the Grand Inquisitor, and it's written in kind of a King James English style, thou and thee and things like that. But if you've never read it, boy, pick it up. I read it as a senior in college. I had such a great year, my senior year in college. I was introduced to so many, Dostoevsky being one of them. By the time I came to graduate, it was like, I'm not ready to graduate. I just started reading these great people. So any thoughts or any questions about this? Well, then let's, I think our time's pretty much on us. We still have a few minutes left, but if you have nothing, I don't know that I can really get into the next chapter without, with any real content. But when we come back, we will be reading this is chapter 12. We'll look at chapter 13 and the story of Andrew and Philip.
Dan?
Yeah, go ahead, Matt.
I have a brief quote that I can
Okay.
give you. It'll take you back to where you started with Tillich.
Okay.
And I think it's appropriate to what we've been talking about today. And he says, we have rediscovered a new approach to the meaning of salvation. The original approach, Christianity, is not a set of prohibitions and commands.
Yeah.
And salvation is not making man better and better. Christianity is the message of a new reality, which is just what you called it, a different term, but same thing, a new reality, which makes the fulfillment of our essential being possible.
Right.
Such being transcends all special prohibitions and commands by one law, which is not law, namely love.
Right. Yes, exactly. And is that from Tillich's systematic theology or?
I'm not sure where it's from.
Oh, okay.
A book of essays that I have. And I'd have to figure it out, but no, it's not from one of his major works.
Yeah. I'll tell you, I am so enlivened and given a new sense of vitality of getting back into Tillich. There comes a time when, nobody's reading Tillich. Nobody wants to read it. He was very, very popular in the 60s, right? And when people were talking about existentialism and all of those things. But, Whaley's on the way, and people, at least in this part of the world, just don't talk about Tillich anymore. He was always lingering in the background, but boy, anymore, I'm thinking at this point in my life, yes, I needed to get back in touch with Paul Tillich because it just really fired me up when I was younger. And that would have been at Vanderbilt, not so much in college. But he's not easy to understand. He's not easy to read. But at least I don't know many people who find him easy to read. But he's worthwhile reading. So anyway, anybody else want to throw a quote in there from what you've been reading lately? I've been reflecting on the quote that Greg Alan Pickett said to me last week in one of our conversations. It's an African proverb that talks about who writes history and who has the authority to write history, and it's one from a guy named Howard Zinn, who wrote the People's History of America, or of the United States. It is, until the lions learn to write, the stories will always praise the hunters. Until the lions learn to write, the stories will always praise the hunters. I see Denny laughing back there. That's, and and when I think about it, I think that's why we're educators, right? We want to offer people that ability to write and to experience the world and speak about and communicate their experience of the world, lest somebody gives them the experience that should be communicated. And so it really renewed my commitment to being an educator, as most of you are as well. All of you, pretty much. All of us are educators in one way or another. So anyway, I'm gonna call it good, and we'll talk about
Hey,
chapter.
Dan,
Yeah, go ahead, Denny.
real quick, rereading James Metchner's Caravans, and on page 49, he has one of his characters say, "But we are never prepared for what we expect." And it just resonated with what you're saying.
Oh, but are you guys reading that together, Will? Oh, I'm now. Where are you reading this book?
Just the two of us.
Oh, just that, yeah. Oh, good. Well, good. Well, I'm glad to see reading is still going on someplace in the world. And other than, on this small little computer we carry around. So, well, anyway, thank you, everybody. I'm going to bid you adieu, and we'll see you next Wednesday for chapter 13. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Dan.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.